Imagine being called by God to leave everything behind. Your land, your family, your security, all this for a promise. Abraham, the father of faith, faced unimaginable challenges, moments of doubt, and almost impossible sacrifices. You are about to discover how he became a central figure in the history of humanity and in the Bible. Stay until the end to understand how this journey can transform your life too. If you are ready to learn something incredible today, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Let's get started. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most advanced cities of its time. He was the son of Terah and lived among a society that worshipped many gods. But the true God had a different plan for him. In an unexpected moment, God revealed himself to Abraham with a challenging order. Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. Now, think about it. Would you give up everything for a promise? Abraham trusted, and that changed everything. He left with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot. The journey was long and full of uncertainty, but God reaffirmed the promise. Abraham would be the father of a great nation. However, there was a problem. He and Sarah had no children, and they were both already old. Imagine the frustration. What would you do? Abraham, however, continued to trust. And it was during this period that God made a covenant with him. He told him to look up at the sky and count the stars, saying, "So will your descendants be." Can you imagine the excitement of hearing that from God? Despite God's promises, time continued to pass, and Abraham and Sarah remained childless. Years had passed since God had promised that Abraham would be the father of a great nation, but reality seemed to contradict the divine plan. Sarah, growing old and already discouraged by the natural impossibility of conceiving, began to be consumed by thoughts of doubt and frustration. After all, how could she, an elderly woman, be the mother of an heir? With each passing day, the silence about the promise became more deafening, and the weight unbearable. Then, in a moment of vulnerability, Sarah proposed something that would change the course of history. She suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant, Hagar. In the culture of the time, it was common for a servant to be able to bear children in the name of her mistress. But that did not mean that it was an easy decision or free of emotional consequences. Sarah probably struggled with herself before making such a proposal. But, overcome by the anxiety of seeing the promise fulfilled in some way, she convinced herself that this could be the path chosen by God. Abraham, in turn, accepted Sarah's suggestion, perhaps torn between the desire to fulfill the promise and the weight of making such a delicate decision. So Hagar became pregnant, and the birth of Ishmael brought both joy and tension to Abraham's home. On the one hand, Ishmael was indeed Abraham's son, and this seemed to be an indication that the promise was beginning to be fulfilled. On the other hand, Sarah, who initially thought she could handle the situation, began to feel jealous and insecure as she saw Hagar and Ishmael occupying a space that she believed was rightfully hers. The home that had once been marked by hope was now permeated by emotional conflicts, tense looks, and a silence that said more than words could express. But even in the face of this new scenario, God made it clear that his plans had not changed. In one of the reaffirmations of his promise, God explained to Abraham that Ishmael would be blessed and would become the father of a great nation, but the full fulfillment of the covenant would come through a son born to Sarah. Imagine the whirlwind of emotions that Abraham must have faced at that moment. The joy for Ishmael, the tension with Sarah, and above all, the need to trust in God even when the path seemed uncertain. Abraham was faced with a constant challenge, dealing with human expectations and, at the same time, remaining firm in the faith that God would fulfill his promises at the right time. When Abraham reached the age of 99, something extraordinary happened. God appeared to him again, bringing a message that would mark a crucial moment in his life and in the history of humanity. Imagine the scene. Abraham, already advanced in age, having lived for decades in expectation of the fulfillment of the divine promise, receives a visitation that not only reaffirms this promise, but also reveals new details about God's plan. It was at this encounter that God proclaimed that the covenant made with Abraham would be eternal and that he and his descendants would be blessed incomparably. As part of this new chapter, God announced significant changes. The names of Abram and Sarai would be changed. Abram, which means exalted father, became Abraham, which means father of multitudes. Likewise, Sarai, who until then meant my princess, became Sarah, which means princess in a universal sense, for from her would come the lineage of kings and nations. These new names were not merely symbolic. They represented a change in the identity and destiny of both, reinforcing that God's promise was about to be fulfilled. Imagine how Abraham and Sarah felt upon hearing these words. Renewed, encouraged, and perhaps still trying to comprehend the enormity of what God was doing. But God did not stop there. At that very moment, he established the physical sign of the everlasting covenant, circumcision. It was a new practice, a symbolic and deeply meaningful act that would mark Abraham's descendants as belonging to God's chosen people. And here is the remarkable thing. Abraham did not hesitate. Despite the novelty and possible difficulty of the act, he obeyed immediately. He himself, along with all the males of his household, was circumcised that very day. This action demonstrated his total submission and faith, showing that he was willing to follow God's instructions, regardless of the cost or discomfort involved. This moment in Abraham's life was much more than a simple renewal of promises. It was a reaffirmation that God is faithful and sovereign in his plans. Even in the face of his advanced age and seemingly impossible circumstances, Abraham trusted and acted. His immediate and unquestioning obedience is a living testament to what it means to walk by faith rather than by sight. Imagine how this example can inspire us to obey God today, even when his instructions seem challenging or difficult to understand. Finally, after years of waiting, God made a specific and direct promise. Sarah would bear a son. It was the culmination of decades of faith and expectation. But when Abraham heard these words, something amazing happened. He laughed. Yes, he laughed. Not out of lack of faith, but perhaps as a natural reaction to the absurdity of the thought of such an elderly couple becoming parents. Abraham was almost 100 years old, and Sarah, at 90, was already far beyond the age at which a woman could conceive. It was as if he were saying, "How can this happen? This is too wonderful to be true." Abraham's laughter was a reflection of his surprise and at the same time, his joy at God's promise, which once again proved that nothing was impossible for him. When God heard Abraham's laughter, he did not rebuke him. On the contrary, he reinforced his word, detailing the promise even further. He said that the son's name would be Isaac, which means laughter. This name carried a profound symbolism. It would be an eternal reminder of God's faithfulness, who accomplishes the impossible even in the most unlikely situations. Imagine Abraham reflecting on this. Every time he called Isaac's name, it would be like repeating, God is faithful. He has kept his promises, even when everything seemed contrary to human logic. And Sarah? When she heard the same promise, she also laughed. But her laughter initially seemed to mix disbelief and irony. After all, how could she conceive a child in her old age? God, however, knew that Sarah's laughter would be transformed. The same God who had promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation now assured him that Sarah would indeed give birth. And when Isaac was born, her laughter would be different. It would be the laughter of complete joy, gratitude, and victory. This moment was not just about Abraham and Sarah. It was an eternal testimony to God's sovereignty and his ability to fulfill promises in the right time, even when human logic has given up on waiting. The choice of the name Isaac, therefore, was much more than a detail. It was a milestone in history, reminding everyone that in God, the impossible becomes possible and that the laughter of doubt can be transformed into laughter of celebration. The story of Isaac teaches us that even in the most unlikely circumstances, we must trust in God's faithfulness. Every laugh, every detail, every promise fulfilled in the lives of Abraham and Sarah is living proof that God never fails. What about you? Is there something in your life that seems impossible? Trust, because God is an expert in transforming tears and doubts into laughter and victory. The birth of Isaac and the great test, and then finally, it happened. The impossible became reality. When Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was already 90, the son of promise was born. Isaac came into the world as a living miracle, concrete proof that God is faithful to his promises, no matter how long it takes or how improbable it may seem. Imagine the joy of Abraham and Sarah as they held that baby in their arms, knowing that they were witnessing something that could only have been the work of God. The laughter that had previously expressed doubt and disbelief now turned into pure celebration. The name Isaac did justice to this moment. Laughter. Every time they called him, it would be a reminder that God had kept his word. But Abraham's journey was still far away. To finish, after the birth of Isaac, years passed, and the child grew up under the care and love of his parents. However, in the midst of this happiness, God had something in store for Abraham, something that would not only test his faith, but would also forever mark the history of humanity. It was a final test, the greatest and most challenging of all. Years later, God spoke to Abraham and made a request that, for any parent, would be inconceivable. He ordered Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, the long-awaited son, the one who represented the divine promise. This order seemed to contradict everything God had set up until that point. After all, how could God ask for the sacrifice of the very heir of the promise? How could Abraham reconcile this in his mind and heart? It was a test of faith and obedience in its most extreme form. Insert question on screen. Could you obey God in something like this? Write your answer in the comments. Abraham, once again, trusted God. He did not hesitate. With a heavy heart but full of faith, he got up early, prepared what he needed, and set out for the mountain God had indicated. Imagine what must have gone through his mind during those days of walking alongside Isaac. Did he wonder why? Did he weep silently as he looked at his son's face? Or did he simply trust, believing that God had a greater plan that he could not yet see? When they reached the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar. He laid the wood, tied Isaac, who, in an act of unparalleled obedience and trust, did not resist, and laid him on the altar. With trembling hands but unshakable faith, Abraham raised the knife, ready to obey God's command. It was the climactic moment, where his devotion would be tested to the limit. But at the last moment, an angel of the Lord intervened. He cried out, "Do not harm the boy. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham, overcome with relief and gratitude, looked around and saw a ram caught in a thicket. God had provided the substitute sacrifice. Abraham offered the ram in Isaac's place, and that moment became an everlasting marker of his absolute faith that God will always provide. This event was not only a test for Abraham, but also a prophetic symbol. Just as God spared Isaac, he would later send his own son, Jesus Christ, as the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of humanity. Abraham's unwavering obedience became an unparalleled example of faith and trust in God's plan. He teaches us that even in the most difficult circumstances, God has a purpose and never fails to provide what is needed at the right time. Abraham's legacy. Abraham's life is a timeless testament to the fact that true faith requires three fundamental elements: patience, obedience, and absolute trust in God. From his initial call to leave his homeland to the most challenging moments of his journey, Abraham demonstrated an unwavering willingness to follow God's plan, even when everything around him seemed uncertain. He lived to the impressive age of 175, and at the end of his life, he was buried next to his beloved wife Sarah in a tomb he had purchased for himself. This final gesture by Abraham represented not only the honor of his life partner, but also the recognition that his story was part of something much greater, the fulfillment of God's promises. Abraham's legacy, however, was not limited to his earthly life. Through Isaac, the son of promise, God began to fulfill his eternal plan. The word spoken to Abraham many years earlier, that he would father a great nation, began to come true. And it was not just a nation that emerged from Abraham, but a lineage that would impact all of humanity. He is revered as one of the pillars of faith in three of the world's major religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. For millions of people, Abraham is more than a historical figure. He is a living example of faith, perseverance, and the power of God's promises. Remember one of God's most powerful promises to Abraham: "Look toward the sky and count the stars, if you are able. So shall your descendants be." Each of those stars symbolized not only Abraham's biological descendants, but all those who, through the generations, would put their faith in God, following Abraham's example. This powerful image of the starry sky continues to inspire people around the world, reminding us that what God promises, He will fulfill, even when circumstances dictate otherwise. And now, a question arises for all of us. Are we willing to trust God with the same faith that Abraham demonstrated? To trust when challenges seem insurmountable? To persevere when the waiting seems endless? The story of Abraham teaches us that, in due time, God always and fulfills His promises. It may not be in our time or in the way we expect, but He never fails. Abraham is living proof that with faith, patience, and obedience, we can participate in something much greater than ourselves. If this story inspired you, made you reflect, or gave you hope, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to help spread this message. Subscribe to the channel for more content that strengthens your faith and activates your purpose. And activate the bell so you don't miss any news. May Abraham's story continue to guide and inspire us on our own journey. Until the next video.